Spring was supposed to bring new life. But for some, it brought something else, a woman whose garden wouldn't stop growing, a group of friends who never made it home from a sunny picnic, a family whose new house began to bloom after midnight, three true stories. Three ordinary people, one season that refused to stay innocent. You're watching Nazir Fears, where every story is real and every fear is earned. Like, subscribe, share, and hit the bell so you never miss the next story that starts like a dream and ends like a warning.
Story 1. The Greenhouse at Hollow Creek, in your Nazir Fears voice. Realistic spring horror. Spring arrived in Hollow Creek like a forgiveness letter, and Emma Hart tried to believe it. She told herself the way the river loosened and the way crocuses pushed up through the beds along her rental's front walk meant this year would be different, meant the hard winter she'd spent asking friends for couches and favors and patience had finally thinned into something livable. And when her new landlord handed her the keys and said, "There's a dilapidated greenhouse out back, came with the property. Do what you like with it," she heard an assignment disguised as hope. The kind of project that could make a person into the kind of person she kept promising to become. The first Saturday of April, she pulled on gloves and dragged a rusted rake around the yard, and beyond the lilac hedge she saw it. A low old timber frame glazed with mottled panes, some fogged with lime, some cracked like weathered ice, and inside a drift of last year's leaves and the pale bones of old tomato stakes. The door stuck, then surrendered, and the smell was a layered thing. Damp soil, rotted wood, a medicinal sweetness from something spilled long ago, and under that a human smell, not sweat, not exactly, more like the inside of a coat worn hard. She stepped carefully, brooming aside brittle stems, and on the back bench found a row of clay pots, labeled in a tidy hand with masking tape. Basil, rosemary, aurora pink, and one that read only June in fainter ink. The tape gone brown at the corners, and in the far corner, a small stack of notebooks bound with twine and swollen by humidity. She didn't open them, she would later, but she did straighten their edges because order felt like progress, and when she turned a plastic tray upside down to shake out the old soil, a glass marble rolled from the lip and ticked across the bench, a new sound in the room. She didn't know why that made her feel like she should check the door again, but she did, and when she looked up, a man stood just beyond the lilacs, hands tucked into his jacket pockets like any neighbor out for a look at the season. "Colin," he said when she waited too long. "Colin Marks, groundsman for the senior cottages over on Whitney Road. I do odd jobs, used to help the woman who lived here with that thing." And he nodded toward the greenhouse, as if it were a person overhearing its own gossip. "She loved it," he said, "till the end, right up to the last spring." And someone less tired than Emma might have noticed what those words asked her to ask. But Emma only smiled, because kindness was a discipline, and said, "If you know where they kept the watering can, you'd save me 10 minutes. And he laughed, and stepped around the lilac hedge, and showed her the metal can nested under the slatted bench, the exact place she would have looked second, and he showed her how the roof vent would crank if you were patient, and how the floor drain clogged if you weren't, and she told him thank you until thank you sounded like something she owed. He did not linger. He had the neat leaving manners of men who know the difference between helpful and noticed. And yet that night, when Emma set the notebooks on her kitchen table and untied the twine, she thought of his hands before she thought of their pages, thought of how easily he'd belonged in her yard. And then she turned to the first page and found a date, April 7th, and a list that had nothing to do with Basil. Walked past at 7:45, light on. 8:12, left by side gate. 8:16, phone call. The handwriting was neat only on the first 2 lines. The third had pressed so hard the loop of the question mark had marked the page below. A phantom. And Emma turned the page and found more days and more times and lines that sounded like weather reports written about a person. Tuesday. trowel in right hand, left sleeve damp. Friday. Talked to delivery man for exact 4 minutes. Sunday. Laughed alone. She shut the notebook and stared at the cupboard door until the wood grain became a map. The woman who had lived here had been watched by someone who liked to make lists, and that someone had called the greenhouse June and kept the records like a prayer. She knew what she should do. Call the landlord, call the police, call someone older who would tell her to move again. But she put the notebooks back on the table because she had moved so much that calling anyone felt like standing up on a bus that never stopped. And instead she told herself this: sometimes people keep track of their own lives in third person when the first person hurts. Sunday she filled the beds with potting soil and sewed a tray of violas because their faces refused tragedy, and she wanted that in the room. And when she looked up, there was Colin again, on the other side of the glass, not waving, not peering, simply existing in that space, as if that space had always had room for him. She opened the door, and he said, "We're planting geraniums over at the cottages. Felt like a day for dirt." And she said, "It is." And he stepped a little closer, and added, "It was her day too," and nodded toward the notebooks, as if he had X-ray sight, as if knowledge circumvented doors. "Who?" she asked finally. And he said the old owner's name, Nora Pennington, and something like relief moved across his face when she did not recognize it. He told her Nora had lived alone, outlived a husband and 2 ideas of herself, and loved tomatoes the way some women love shoes. And he said when Nora had become less herself in winter, the greenhouse made her remember. And then he pointed to the far pane where a network of scratches had turned light into a quilt and said, "She used to etch dates there with a pin when things bloomed out of season." And the romanticism of that almost cancelled the unease of the notebooks, almost. Then he said, "Be careful with the roof crank, it sticks," and left before she could ask him the question she'd meant to ask: who wrote the lists? A day later, Mrs. Pennington's name introduced itself for real. A woman with a white cardigan and a voice full of neighborly grammar appeared at Emma's fence and said, "You must be the new tenant. Nora was my cousin." And Emma set her trowel down and said, "I'm Emma." And the woman said, "Dorothy Pennington, but Dot is fine," and then said, "You've cleaned up the greenhouse beautifully," using the same tone people use when they talk about dressing a body for viewing. Emma offered her iced tea, which Dot accepted and did not drink, and in the sun at the little iron table, Emma asked about Nora's garden, and Dot told her briskly. Nora had been organized. Nora had liked rituals. Nora had been lost by degrees, and near the end had gone out most afternoons to check her seedlings, and some evenings had not come in until Dot called her twice. And yes, that was odd in winter, but, well, Nora was odd. And when Emma said the notebook's existence out loud, Dot's mouth grew into a tight, polite disapproval meant for other topics, and she said, "We don't rummage," and finished her tea. That night Emma dreamed in lists. 7:15. Emma turned off porch light. 7:22. Emma stood very still. 7:29. Emma listened. She woke with a sick certainty, and went to the back door and found a small, clean shoe print on the greenhouse's threshold, smaller than a man's, not a child's, narrower, someone who wore careful shoes. She told herself it was hers from yesterday, then stepped her own foot into it, and found it didn't match. By mid-April, the greenhouse had language again. The violas stood at attention, and the basil forgot what winter was. And Emma kept the notebooks in a drawer, and touched them sometimes like people touch pilgrim stones, not for magic, but for proof of having come this far. She met the rest of the street in manageable units, Mr. and Mrs. Fuentes 2 houses down, who argued in the rhythm of marriage, and always returned each other to laughter. Rhea from the corner, who ran 3 miles every morning, as if they needed to be held down. the delivery guy from the nursery who called everyone boss and thought it charming. And she learned to wave at Colin at the exact angle that meant thanks without meaning visit. On an ordinary Thursday, the river ice finally withdrew into the idea of itself, and the senior cottages put out plastic chairs like colourful punctuation, and Emma went to the grocery for bread, and the woman at the till said, "Greenhouse season," and Emma felt included in a secret handshake. She returned home with 2 bags, and saw the back door already open. A simple, unremarkable fact, except she remembered closing it. Remembered because the latch sometimes didn't catch, and she had made a habit of slamming it like punctuation. And she put the bags down and said, "Hello?" Not like a person who expects an answer, but like a person who has decided the answer must not know her fear. No answer, of course. Only the sound of the fridge, and, underneath that, something like breathing slowed down. The small consistent hum of the greenhouse's roof vent motor, which she hadn't switched on since the night she had tried it, and it had refused her. She crossed the yard in 3 quick steps, and found the vent slightly open, the crank not where she'd left it, a hair's width of outside air making the room feel like an inhalation held too long. On the workbench lay a new thing, a set of seed packets bound with a rubber band, all labelled Aurora Pink, none of them from brands she knew, and a note on plain paper, "Sow 3 every morning, water at 7:15 p.m. You'll see. No name, no signature, a tidy hand that could have belonged to anyone who liked rules. Emma held the paper like you hold a bug you want to return to the outside, and the urge to laugh at the hubris of strangers who appoint themselves keepers, at her own body for wanting to obey instructions left in her house, rose and fell. She put the note on the bench and backed out and locked the greenhouse door with the little padlock that came on the latch, and walked inside and called the police because a neighbour who leaves schedules for your life in your space is what the word report is for. The officer on the phone took her name and the address, and asked the ordinary questions, and scheduled a time. And the time was tomorrow, which made tonight long. She texted Dot because Dot was a person the officers would want, and Dot replied, "Of course." And then, after a pause, "Don't make it a fuss," which almost made Emma cancel out of spite. At 6:41, while dinner asked not to be burned, someone knocked. It wasn't the police early. It was Colin, holding a small black bag the kind flour comes in, and saying, "Coffee, left over from the cottages, thought you might like it." And she almost said, "Did you open my door?" and did say, "Thank you." And he did that neat leaving thing again, except this time he turned back from the walkway and said, "Strange, isn't it, how plants sometimes take instruction better than people?" And her skin felt like a jar she'd left the lid too loose on. "What do you mean?" she asked, and he shrugged, easy, and looked at the greenhouse, and said, "You'll see," the exact phrase from the note, and then, "Nora believed that variety would fruit earlier if watered after supper." She called it her Aurora Pink, after the grocery receipt ink told me it was like teaching time a new trick. And Emma decided she would wait for the police on the porchlight circle, like a person who believed in circles. They came, too young, polite, their belts heavier than their experience, and they looked at the note and the seed packets and the door latch, and wrote all the right lines, and told her to keep doors secured and phone immediately if anyone returns, and before they left, one of them, Officer Haynes, said, "You can install a camera in the greenhouse if you want, there's probably power." And Emma said, "There is," and Haynes nodded like he'd expected that. And somewhere in the conversation the subject of the notebooks came up, and she produced them, and Haynes read a page and said, "Whoever wrote this liked keeping time." And she found herself offering up the name Colin the way a person offers up a guess they don't want to be right, and Haynes wrote it down with the gentle neutrality officers are trained to wear, and he said they'd have a word, and when they were gone, Emma stood in the kitchen and realized she had learned a new count, the minutes between now and 7:15. She did not intend to obey the note. Anyone who knows Emma would tell you that. She intended to roast a chicken and watch a streaming show in which other people's choices ended in neat red credits and go to bed in a house where all the latches held. She did all of that except the neatness, and at 7:14 a sound like a soft radio tuning itself came from the yard, a thin thrumming that could have been the vent adjusting. The wind, the kettle, anything a brain might generously mislabel. She told herself that, and at 7:15 precisely, her porch camera pinged, and when she checked the feed, the greenhouse was darker than the yard around it, wrong darker, and she stood and walked outside and found the padlock gone, the door open an inch, and inside the bench light glowed and the seed packets were gone, and in their place 3 pots had been filled with new soil, pressed in with the neatness of rules, and across the bench a sheet of plastic had been taped, dusty at the edges from older tape, etched faintly in the corner with a grid and the word June. Some part of Emma refused to let the fear be just fear, and stepped inside and lifted the plastic, and beneath it the soil in the 3 pots looked wet, as if it had been made to remember water, and absurdly, impossibly, 3 pale cotyledons had already split, small and perfect and reaching in a room with no sun. She knew it wasn't possible, knew that sometimes the mind will rewrite time to make a story fit, but there they were, 3 tiny green tongues tasting a light they had not earned. Her phone vibrated in her back pocket, and she flinched so hard the plastic snapped and the cotyledons shivered, and the call was from private number, and she let it die, and immediately a text arrived. Good. Better than last year. You're on schedule now. She called Haynes back, and the voicemail instructed her to call the switchboard, and she did. And the switchboard said a car would swing by, and for the first time she did not want a car to swing by, because this thing felt like something a car couldn't understand. At 9:03, a light moved in the senior cottage's lot 2 streets over, and paused and went on. And at 9:27 her porch camera caught Dot crossing the yard with a cardigan over her nightdress, and Dot knocked on the back door and said, "Don't be angry. Colin told me you'd found the schedule." And Emma said, "Dot, did you let yourself in here earlier?" And Dot said, "Of course not," sounding injured by the idea that keys made any difference. And then Dot looked past Emma into the greenhouse, and her face arranged itself toward grief, and she said, "You shouldn't have started the Aurora." And Emma almost laughed at the ridiculousness of untangling pronouns in a crime. And then Dot added softly, "Nora died on June 7th. And the date struck the word, etched in the plastic like a tuning fork. Dot told a compressed story, how Nora had become rigid in kindness, how she had scheduled herself into safety, how one spring she had begun to believe the plants would go faster for her if she asked correctly, how Colin had helped with kindness the way men sometimes do because they enjoy being keys, and how the lists had started then, first Nora's of the tomatoes, and then someone else's of Nora, and how after Nora fell ill, Colin mowed her grass and took out her bins and watered her plants at 7:15, and how after Nora died, Dot found him in the greenhouse in July, sitting very still, not praying and not gardening and not quite trespassing, and she had not told him to leave because some rooms belong to everyone who has tended them. Emma listened because it is easy to listen to facts. She did not say the pots had sprouted like tricks. She did not show Dot the text. She walked Dot to the gate and latched it, and watched Dot stagger a little on the uneven pavers the way people do when they carry more than their bodies. At 11:11, because humans like numbers that explain themselves, Emma's phone rang again private, again ignored, and then a final message. Tomorrow you'll thin to 1. Don't choose wrong this time. She did not sleep so much as take shifts with herself. At 3:12 she woke, and at 4:40 she woke, and at 6:01 she woke, and at 7:15 she was already in the greenhouse, because if obedience is sometimes safety, then sometimes it is surveillance. The 3 sprouts had opened into green that had no right to open that fast, and inside one cotyledon, on the smallest plant, the light made a pinprick, bright like a bead of water, and when she looked closely she saw it was glass, a tiny lens set into the rim of a pot, where the soil met the plastic, an eye. She picked up the pot and turned it, and the soil crumbled under its own newness, and a black wafer the size of a coin fell into her palm. A camera with a flattened wire run thin through the soil to the bench's underside, and from there to the frame, and from there, likely to some place outside the pane. She thumbed off the wafer's power and heard, or thought she heard, the vent motor exhale. She put the wafer on the bench and stared at the 3 little plants, as if they could tell her which of them did not contain an eye. She didn't thin anything. She didn't water. She took photos and sent them to Haynes and to Dot, and to herself as if duplication could be armor. She waited for the knock that didn't come. At 10:30 a.m. she removed the bench light and found a second wafer taped to its underside. At noon, a white van with no signage rolled slow along the lane and did not stop, and at 12:07 her phone pinged with a new message from a number now unhidden, one she recognized from the senior cottage's website. Colin Marks. Maintenance. The message read, "You'll kill them if you neglect them, like last year. Do you enjoy killing what people love?" She wanted to be the kind of person who laughed and sent screenshots and took the day off work to sit on the porch with the police. She turned the message into a report, and Haynes replied with, "We're coming by now." And when they did, Colin stood in his yard 2 blocks over, with his hands still in his pockets, and said he had never texted anything, that his phone had been hacked last year by a nephew, that he had helped Nora only out of kindness, that if Emma had a problem with him, she should say it. He smiled, the practiced smile of people who know how much neighbor benefit of the doubt costs. The officers nodded in a way that meant civil and meant document and meant watch, and Emma watched. She installed the greenhouse camera Haynes had suggested, and she wired the door to ping her, and she sanded the side gate latch smooth, so any new adjustment would announce itself. At 7:15 that night, the camera caught no one inside, only a hand through the vent gap, tossing a pinch of something into the pots like confetti, and then withdrawing fast, a hand too far for the camera to own. And when she went in and gently brushed the soil's top, she could feel granules like fertilizer, and she could smell something floral and bitter. She watered, not to obey, but to collect evidence of change, and the next morning 2 of the seedlings were fine, and one had shriveled into a question mark. She thinned nothing. She saved the wafer. She saved the message. She saved herself by remembering the word pattern. It is how you convict a life. That afternoon Dot called to say Colin had come by with a bag of compost, and that she had told him the police were involved, and his face behaved. And Emma sat on the steps and watched Bee Shadow move across the pavers, and decided that when a thing in your life demands rituals with times and rules and scolds, when you fail them, you are not gardening. You are being kept. She went to the hardware store and bought a new hasp, and a heavy lock, and screws long enough to bite the past. And while she measured the frame, she noticed the faint etch of June in the plastic's corner again, and beneath it a second word, smaller, almost a joke, seen. She stared at it until her eyes made it seed, and then seen again, and she laughed once, a sound like a branch cracking in frost. The end arrived, like most endings do, not with a scene, but with a practical decision. She texted Dot to meet her at 5. She texted Haynes to swing by if he could, and at 4:30 she opened every vent, and propped the greenhouse door, and carried the bench light to the bin, and plucked every wire she could see, and set them on the concrete like skinny fish, and called out loud, for Colin, for the camera, for the greenhouse itself, "We're done." a sentence that didn't feel like victory so much as correct punctuation. 10 minutes later, footsteps in gravel, not running, not sneaky, just a person who has decided the porch is a room, and there was Colin at the gate, and behind him, 2 women from the cottages who had loved Nora's tomatoes, and behind them Dot. And behind Dot, the idea of a street that had refused to choose a side until someone had asked. Colin said, quiet, "You don't get to ruin what she loved." And Emma said, steady, "You don't get to keep using the living to rerun the dead." And one of the women from the cottages said, "It isn't hurting anyone." And Dot said, softly but with a lawyer's cadence she had not shown before, "It hurt Nora." And Haynes's car rolled up then, as if a stage manager had finally remembered the cue. And in the practical sun of 5 p.m. in a small town in April, the officer asked Colin about the wafers and the texts and the vent hand, and Colin said words about tradition and community and help, and Haynes said words about trespass and harassment and orders, and Dot said more words about Nora's last months and keeping and compulsion. And in the end the paper Haynes handed over said cease and stay away, and devices and return, and the women from the cottages looked at the greenhouse as if it had failed them personally, and then left. And Colin left too, hands still in his pockets like cuffs that hadn't closed. And Dot hugged Emma in a quick sideways way and said, "We will grow other things." And Emma stood in the doorway of the greenhouse, while the air in it recalculated itself around no one's rules. She took the notebooks out that night, and put them in a box, and gave the box to Dot, and asked her to decide. And Dot decided to burn them, and then decided to keep them, and then decided to put them in a drawer, until deciding itself felt less like violence. In May, the violas were a determined choir, and the basil did what basil does, and the aurora pink seeds never did anything again. Sometimes, at 7:15, Emma stood at the sink and watched the greenhouse without going out, and once, at 7:15 on a Thursday, she saw a silver car pause and go on, and she felt nothing complicated at all, only a small, finished thing, like a list with a line through it. When June came, she did not etch the word in the plastic. She took the plastic down and replaced it with new. And when friends asked what she grew that first spring, she said boundaries, and they laughed at the joke because people like it when safety learns a new word. And she did not bother to explain that sometimes the most frightening thing isn't a man or a camera or a text at 7:15. It's the subtle way a season that promises to open everything can be used to close a person into a schedule they didn't write, minute by minute, until they forget that gardens are supposed to grow out, not in. Story 2. The Picnic That Never Ended. Spring in Meadow. Vale had that soft, sincere light that makes bad ideas look like traditions. So when Thomas Hale suggested a Sunday picnic to mark the end of the rains, Sarah said yes, because saying yes to small things had become her way of refusing to believe in large ones, and their friends Ben Carter and Eliza Moore agreed, because 32 is an age where you start rehearsing the lives you hope you'll deserve. They chose Wren Park because the sycamores there made shade that looked like something planned, and the footpath along the creek kept children busy without feeling like work, and because in spring the town hung new bunting on the lampposts and pretended it was for everyone. They met late, 1:10 p.m., because Ben's sister had borrowed his car and returned it smelling faintly of cheap cherry spray, and Thomas had forgotten the corkscrew, and Sarah had stood in the kitchen longer than necessary staring at a note on the fridge that read, "Plans are just promises you haven't broken yet," which her therapist would call a thought, not a command, and she would call accurate. Still, they went, and they spread a navy blanket that Thomas said had been his father's, and set out paper cups and a borrowed wicker basket and a tin of shortbread Eliza's mother sent for when tea requires biscuits. And the day made the sound of spring. Bikes with unoiled chains, a dog practicing a bark, a child naming ducks as if they were new gods. The four of them ate brie that claimed France and strawberries that swore England and laughed at things that can't be remembered later because they exist only to prove the throat still works. If the story ended there, it would be a picture and not a story at all. It shifts when they notice the man under the birch. No, not notice, name. Because noticing is what you do with a bird, and naming is what you do with a person who might remember you. He wore a pale windbreaker, and a cap that looked chosen rather than worn. And he sat with a paperback he did not turn. The way people perform being alone in public when their attention belongs elsewhere. Sarah felt her ribcage do that quiet, animal expand, that says catalogue the exits, and she did. Because you can love a Sunday, and still belong to your training. She looked for badges of ordinary. A picnic bag, a phone cable, a bottle of water, a shadow that says I arrive with sun, but he had only that book and a small paper sack folded twice, and from it he lifted nothing. He's fine, Eliza said, because women learn to be generous about men in parks until generosity costs too much. Thomas poured more wine and said, to the first real day, and Ben told a story about a client who used the phrase circle back, like a threat. At 2:07, the park's PA system announced a lost balloon in the voice of someone who had always wanted to be a pilot. At 2:11, the man stood, folded the paper sack carefully, and in the odd way the world does favors you don't ask for. A frisbee sailed toward him from the green, and he kept it. He didn't catch and toss. He kept it, and only then did his face make a choice. He smiled, but not at the thrower, at Sarah, as if to demonstrate that keeping is a conversation. Don't, Ben said gently, just that one word, the best word men can say when they understand the math. Sarah smiled back anyway, not because she wanted to, but because refusing to smile can be escalation in towns where escalation looks like bad manners. And then she stood, because the restroom sat beyond the rose garden, and the rose garden was where the path dipped out of sight, and she preferred making the first move to waiting to see if he would. She took her bag because bags become shields if you hold them correctly, and she told herself as she walked what therapists and mothers and good police officers tell. Tell someone where you are going. Keep your phone in your hand. Look like you belong to people who will come looking. The roses were embarrassed by their own efforts, buds with too much hope, and the path had that spring slick where winter's last water refused to belong to a season. Half a minute in, she realized he had taken the parallel path on the other side of the rose bed, not following exactly, just moving when she did. He kept the book in his left hand and the paper bag in his right, and he looked ahead like a person uninterested in anyone at all. At the restrooms, a small queue of girls in leotards made the world safe by existing, by narrating their recital in past tense, by tying shoelaces with sacramental seriousness. He did not enter. He waited by the drinking fountain and used it without bending, as if a posture coach had designed it. Sarah told herself to time her return differently, loop behind the willow, exit near the bandstand. And she did. And when she did, he had returned to the birch, as if nothing, as if his body had been a placeholder for a different afternoon. She sat back on the blanket and said nothing, because she was always trying not to be the person who ruins picnics. Thomas said, "All good?" And she said, "All good." And they ate the shortbread. And at 2:40, a brass trio near the bandstand began something from an old movie that had no right to sound like memory, and children danced for phones, and Ben checked his watch and said he'd promised to help his sister by 4. And Eliza lay back and said she could live on this blanket forever, like a soft version of penance. When the trio finished, a man with a microphone announced a spring raffle to fund the skate park lights, and a clerk from the council laid 3 plastic crates on a folding table and said, "Tickets £2. And Thomas, being the kind of person who thinks buying things is a way of loving towns, stood and went to buy 4. The man in the windbreaker did not move. The announcement made a shape in the afternoon that the 4 of them stepped into. It gave them a reason to be 3 and 1 for a few minutes, and those minutes were where the story did its work. At 2:54, Sarah noticed the windbreaker man leave his birch and walk toward the creek with the paper bag not folded, but open, and from it he lifted 3 sandwiches wrapped in wax paper and set them on the bench by the water one by one. Precise, as if the placement mattered as much as the eating. And then he walked away from them without taking one. A boy of 7, maybe 8, darted to the bench, touched a sandwich, looked up at his father, who was staring at his phone, and took it. "Don't," Sarah said again, softly, like a parent to a stove, and then louder to the father. "Hey, that's not from you." And the father looked confused because the phrase had too many negatives for a day like this. He took the sandwich from the boy, and the boy cried the specific cri de coeur of children who believe the world has been designed to deprive them of deliciousness. The father set the sandwich back on the bench, and the man in the windbreaker, at a distance that made refusing a conversation polite, nodded at Sarah once, a punctuation. Thomas returned with 4 blue tickets and said, "What did I miss?" And Sarah said, "Nothing, because telling a person they just bought 4 chances to win a slow trap is poisonous. And what trap anyway?" The raffle began at 3:10, and the first prize was a hamper of local jam, and the second was a voucher for a bike shop, and the third was a night at a bed and breakfast that had renamed itself the Vale House during the pandemic to make itself more a place and less a building. The man in the windbreaker won nothing, because he had bought no tickets, because he was not there for prizes, and when people cheered, he did not clap. He watched the faces the way biologists watch small mammals when they're trying to decide who survives winters best. At 3:25 the trio began again, something from a wedding, and Eliza said, "If I ever get married, I want brass." And Ben said, "You'll hate it by the 3rd chorus." And Thomas said, "They always do." And Sarah said nothing because inside her, something had settled into a seated position, with its back very straight. "We could walk the creek," Thomas offered, as if movement could intercept what she wouldn't name, and they did, carrying the blanket as a folded permission slip just in case. The creek pretended to be a river, a small spring arrogance, and the willow performed its weeping, and halfway down the path a chalkboard sign leaned against a fence that read, "Spring Picnic, Private Arrow," in a hand that made the arrow look like a decision. Beyond the fence was the community garden, locked this time of year except on volunteer days, and the arrow pointed to the service gate that led eventually back toward the council sheds. You could imagine, if you wanted to, a private event there, but Sarah had lived here long enough to know the garden volunteers kept secrets only about squash. Still, a couple in matching raincoats followed the arrow, and then a trio of teenagers, and then a woman with 2 small children whose stroller wheels hated gravel. And when the service gate clanked shut again, Sarah looked back toward the birch and found the windbreaker man had left his book on the grass, and the book was open to a page that held no words, only a pocket cut into the paper like a cistern. "Do you want to leave?" she asked Thomas quietly, and he said, "If you want to." And she said, "I want to." And he said, "Then we will. Because the best men in horror are the ones who refuse to argue with the part of you that has ears. Leaving should be easy. You pick up your blanket, you shoulder your bag, you take the path to the car park, you leave." They did the first 3. The 4th tried not to happen. A council van had nosed across the exit with its hazard lights blinking and a laminated maintenance card on the dash, and a man in an orange vest stood with a clipboard saying, "5 minutes, folks. Sorry, just a quick power check." and behind them the raffle man announced a group photo for the town newsletter, and the brass trio played a march that made standing still feel obedient. "Side gate," Ben said, pointing to the path behind the toilets that led up to the library, and the four of them took it. And the side gate that had always been open on Sundays because librarians believe in mercy had a chain through it today because chains believe in nothing. "Other way," Eliza said, meaning the alley by the tennis courts, and when they reached it, a woman with a stroller said, "Don't mud," and her voice had that bright, lying quality adults use to keep children from doing the thing that will break the day. Sarah understood then that the trap had no bars and didn't need them, that closing exits was just patience dressed up as logistics. She took out her phone and opened the camera app and turned on video, because evidence is the only kind of prayer the law accepts, and she panned slowly from the council van to the group at the garden gate, to the birch to the creek, to the man in the windbreaker who had reappeared near the council sheds, talking to a man in an orange vest whose uniform matched the van, and she felt her heart make that small betrayed laugh that organs make when they realize they have been naive. "What is it?" Thomas asked, and she said, "Look." And he looked, and he said, "Coincidence." And she said, "No." And Ben, who spent his days reading contracts for enemies he had never met, said nothing at all because he knew a pattern when it wrote itself on paper. At 3:42, the hazard lights on the van stopped, and the man with the clipboard waved a small apology, and people flowed to the car park like syrup-freed, and Sarah, Thomas, Ben, and Eliza went with them. And the man in the windbreaker was not there, and the book with the pocket was gone. At the car, Sarah saw a yellow card under the wiper, the kind the council uses for warnings, and her stomach turned because warnings are often gifts that come after the harm. The card read, "Spring clean, free car wash this way," with a smiling droplet in clip art, and she laughed because clip art is never where safety lives. "Don't," she said again for the third time, and Thomas pretended not to have thought of it. And they got in the car and drove away, and the road out of Wren Park curved the way roads curve, when towns are afraid of straight lines. And on the curb near the park exit, a table had been set up with 3 teenagers in matching t-shirts, reading Vale Youth Fund, and a sign that said "Car Wash, Donation." And Sarah watched as the car in front turned in, and she watched the teens surround it with buckets and sponges, and she watched the man in the windbreaker, now in a navy hoodie, step from behind the shed and take the driver's keys so we don't get water inside. And she watched the driver, an old man with a hat that said "Gone Fishing," hand over the keys because handing over keys is what we practice our whole lives for. Apartments, cars, drawers, hearts. "Keep driving," she said, and Thomas did. And Eliza said, "What happened?" And Sarah said, "I don't know, but not that." And Ben said, "Not that." You could argue that nothing actually happened to them that day. You could say they left with all the things they brought, that nothing was taken but ease, that fear is not a crime. You could, but the weak would disagree. On Monday, Ben texted that his sister's car, borrowed again, had gone missing from outside her flat across town after some kids insisted on cleaning it for a fundraiser in a different park. On Tuesday, Eliza's mother called to ask if she'd made a large purchase with Eliza's debit card at a petrol station kiosk. "Just gift cards, darling. Did you need to send money to someone all of a sudden?" And Eliza said no, and cancelled her card and began the pilgrimage of refund emails. On Wednesday, Thomas found a scratch under the driver's side door handle, like a key had measured its ambition there, and Sarah found a slip of paper under their doormat that read, "Picnics are so much better with plans printed in the kind of font thieves use when they think fonts can launder intention." They went to the police because that is what even clever people do when something larger than annoyance begins to practice itself on your life. And the officer at the desk nodded, and wrote and used phrases like probable coordinated distraction and seasonal cruise and custodial investigations in progress. And when Sarah mentioned the windbreaker and the sandwiches and the book with the pocket, the officer didn't laugh. He said, "We've had reports in 2 other parks. Same setup, different faces." And then, generously, "You did the right thing by not engaging." And, less generously, "Video helps more than stories." And Sarah uploaded what she had and left feeling grateful to have a small job to do. Thursday rained. A hard, direct rain that made the road look like one long reflective thought. And Wren Park would have been empty except for ducks. Friday dawned clean, the way Fridays perform goodness, and Sarah woke to the sound of a message arriving. A link from a neighborhood group to a post about spring cleanup volunteers, same clip art droplet, same arrow, and in the comments a woman named Claire B. wrote, "Such nice boys. Washed my car, though I said I didn't need it, and then lost my keys later. Silly me, and then found them in my mailbox. Angels, and then, 20 minutes later, update. Spare keys missing. The thread unraveled in real time. Doorbell clips, plate numbers that belonged to no cars. Kids who were too old to be kids. Children whose mothers didn't recognize them. And the neighborhood group did the thing neighborhoods do. It argued with itself, and then promised to look out for one another, and then planned a meeting, and then suggested snacks. Sarah scrolled and scrolled until the scrolling felt like scratching, and then stopped and went outside and looked at her car, and at the tiny town street, and at the bunting that had stayed cheerful in the rain, and she recognized the shape of the afternoon that had made the trap, the publicness, the purpose, the petty logistics that cinch like zippers. You are part of something. You are generous. You are not a person who assumes cruelty. She closed her eyes and saw the sandwiches again, placed 3 in a row. She opened them and saw the old man hand over his keys. She wrote to the officer and received a reply that said they were following leads, and that a council employee had been let go after improper use of uniform. Saturday morning she and Thomas returned to Wren Park, because pretending you have no fear is sometimes how you keep a kind of fear small. They walked the creek and sat at the birch, and there was no windbreaker, no teens, no van. There was a new sign on the car wash table that read, "Closed by order of council," and a flower tucked into the plastic sleeve. They stayed an hour, and it was fine. And on the way home a silver hatchback slid out from a side street and followed for 4 turns and then didn't. And when it turned away, Sarah's body released a kind of love she hadn't let herself name for years. Gratitude that nothing had become everything. Weeks later, nobody could say exactly how many cars had been taken, or how many keys had been copied, or how many accounts had been shaved down by gift cards and withdrawals so small they looked like rounding errors. Nobody could say whether the windbreaker man had been anyone at all, or just a story Sarah's fear invented to hold a job. The paper ran an article with the polite headline, "Spring Scams Put Residents on Alert," and a photo of a council van. Nobody admitted to driving. The police posted a list of advice in bullet points that made safety feel like a hobby. Avoid impromptu services. Decline unsolicited help. Never hand over keys for any reason. Watch for uniforms without badges. Verify events with organizers. Always keep one person with your belongings. The list made Sarah angry because lists work only if the world signs the contract, and the world doesn't sign anything. She stopped going to picnics, yes, for a while, and then she didn't, because refusing soft things is how the hard things win. She kept the navy blanket in the boot of the car, and the corkscrew in the glove box, and the shortbread tin on a shelf, and the video file backed up in 3 places. In late May, on a weekday, with the sky designed by a watercolorist, she and Thomas returned to Wren Park with 2 coffees, and a sense that you cannot quit a place for behaving like all places. And there, in the distance by the council sheds, for a second too short to be evidence and too long to be nothing, She saw the windbreaker man with his cap and his posture and his book. And he turned a page this time, so that maybe she would forgive him his earlier pretense. And then he stood and walked toward the bandstand where a summer group was practicing, and he did not look back. "Do you see him?" she asked Thomas, and Thomas said, "Who?" And she said, "No one." And for once the sentence was true. On the notice board by the gate, a flyer for spring picnic, community, all welcome flapped in the lightest breeze, and someone had written in pen at the bottom, in a hand like a warning sign trying to be a joke, "Bring your own keys. Keep them." Story 3. The House That Bloomed Again. Spring makes even empty houses sound alive, and when Daniel and Ruth Kerrigan bought the old terrace on Alder Row, the estate agent said, "She always flowers early," as if the bricks themselves had a schedule. The windows had that brittle shine of places that have seen too much polish and too few people, and Ruth, tired from rented flats that came with other people's smells, fell for the lemon trees in the yard, their buds so determined they looked defiant. The couple moved in on an April Saturday, their daughter Grace chasing dust motes that moved like fairies in the slanted light. And that first night Ruth swore she heard watering, a soft spill, rhythmic, inside the walls. Daniel blamed the pipes, then the gutters, then the rats the surveyor had promised were long gone. The sound came every night at 3:11 a.m., a measured pour that ended with the sigh of a stopper pushed back into a bottle. By the third week, the lemon trees bloomed white and sweet and wrong, the kind of sweetness that drags memory up from where you've buried it, and bees arrived from nowhere, though no one on Alder Row kept hives. Ruth found a shoe print in the damp soil beneath the laundry window, narrower than Daniel's, too new for any tradesman. She said nothing because safety in marriage often hides behind silence, but she started locking the back gate and checking it twice, the way her mother had checked gas knobs during wars that were not hers. Grace began waking at dawn to talk to someone outside. The flower lady, she called her, though every time Ruth looked out, the yard was empty, except for the shadow of the lemon branches making silhouettes that could almost wave back. The neighbors knew the house. They always do. Mrs. Feld at number 9 said an old florist had lived there for 40 years, Mrs. Harriet Dove, who grew blooms out of season and sold them cheap because love shouldn't cost market rate. She had died the previous spring, found on the kitchen tiles with the tap running, the coroner listing the time of death as 3:11 a.m. Daniel laughed when Ruth told him because laughter is how engineers disassemble ghosts. "Coincidence of water pressure," he said. But coincidences don't replant themselves, and by May the flower beds had reorganized overnight, the daffodils gone, replaced by blue hyacinths that no one in the family had bought. A smell of soil followed them indoors now, faint but constant, and once Ruth woke to find a trail of wet petals across the living room rug, leading to the locked door of the cellar. Daniel insisted it was Grace playing. Grace insisted it wasn't. The cellar key was gone from the hook. On a Sunday, Ruth asked the estate agent whether Mrs. Dove had family. He said too quickly, "No one living," then excused himself to take a call. That night, Ruth dreamt of watering cans beating like clocks. At 3:11 she woke to find the bedroom air heavy with humidity and Daniel sitting upright, listening. "It's under us," he said. They went down together, torch beam slicing the dark, until they reached the cellar door, which now stood open, not kicked, not forced, simply unlocked, as if by courtesy. Inside, the concrete floor glistened like skin after fever, and from its center rose a narrow bed of black soil arranged with care. Tulips, fresh, dewy. Their roots not in pots, but threaded directly through cracks that had not existed before. Among them lay the missing key, tied with green twine, and a small card flecked with mold. For the new tenants, water faithfully. Daniel wanted to fill the cellar with concrete. Ruth wanted to call someone, though she couldn't say who. They compromised by doing nothing, which is how families fail politely. The next morning, Grace was in the yard, pressing her hands to the bark of the lemon tree and whispering, "She says thank you for watering." When Ruth asked who she was, Grace pointed to the reflection in the kitchen window, Ruth's own outline, doubled by the light. That evening Ruth unplugged every appliance, certain the humming she heard wasn't electrical. She called the council about drainage. The inspector came, pale, kind, said he'd never seen a basement bed like it, and left promising paperwork that never came. Within a week, 3 houses on Alder Row reported blooms out of season, all white, all fragrant. A month later, when Daniel finally brought in a contractor to seal the cellar, they found the soil gone and a ring of damp bricks shaped like a wreath. The foreman joked it looked like a burial but prettier. That night, the smell of lemons thickened until breathing felt sweet and wrong, and the sound of watering returned. Above them now, not below. Grace's room was wet with mist, her window flung open, petals pasted to her pillow. She was fine, only asleep, but the tap in her small hands was turned on though the bathroom stood dry. Ruth told Daniel they had to leave, that the house was practicing them, not the other way round. He said moving again would ruin them financially, and maybe he was right. But staying ruined something else. At 3:11 that final night, Ruth woke to find Daniel gone from bed, and the hallway glowing faintly green, a gardener's light. Downstairs, he stood in the kitchen doorway, eyes unfocused, watering the floor with the old brass can from the cellar, murmuring, "Just enough," she said, "just until it blooms again." The water pooled around his feet and began to steam, smelling of cut stems and rain. Ruth shouted, grabbed his arm. The can fell, and the steam rose thicker, forming shapes that resembled petals turning themselves inside out. Daniel came back like a diver breaching, choking, saying, "She wanted the roots to stay wet, so they remember." They fled before dawn, leaving furniture, photos, even Grace's toys, drove until the sun looked ordinary again. 2 months later, the estate listing reappeared online. Charming spring property, remarkable indoor garden potential. The photos showed the kitchen bright, the cellar sealed, the lemon trees in new bloom. Only one detail seemed wrong. The caption on the final image read, "Taken 3:11 a.m."